Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR and Sirius XM Channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, diversity, equity, and inclusion and why DEI is on the chopping block for some. With the new administration and Congress coming in, there is heightened concern among civil rights groups that dismantling DEI is a legislative priority. So what's the future of DEI, and what would such efforts mean for Black and Brown communities? My guest is Katie Euchre, Director of the Economic Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Katie, thank you so much for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Before we get into the complexities of this issue, let's first talk some quick, fast facts. Last year, there were some 65 bills introduced to limit DEI in higher education in 25 states. 8 of those bills actually became law. And we have seen recent reports show several prominent U.S. companies rolling back or eliminating DEI initiatives. They include Walmart, Ford, Lowe's, Boeing, John Deere, Tractor Supply, and Harley Davidson, just to name a few. Before we talk specifically about some of the issues, can we give our listeners a firm definition of DEI when we're talking about education and the workplace?
I'm so glad you asked that question to begin with, because there's a lot of confusion around this. And the confusion is intentionally created by people who oppose such practices. But diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility measures, first of all, they are not discriminatory. They're not about dictating hiring decisions or filling quotas. These are programs that help ensure we're fulfilling our existing civil rights and duties, and that our government and institutions are serving all the people. So these are programs that are about eliminating barriers to opportunity that qualified, hardworking people face. And in order to reach our full potential as a country and stay globally competitive, we have to make sure that the most talented people get a chance to have a seat at the table. And that's what diversity, inclusion, equity, inclusion, and accessibility measures are all about.
Well, when we talk about DEI and compare it to affirmative action, for example, what's the difference?
Yeah, good question. So these ideas or terms are often conflated, confused, and mixed up. But they can be, affirmative action is typically associated with higher education admissions programs. That's what most people think of when they think of affirmative action, which historically, for many, many decades, the Supreme Court had recognized that universities and colleges could consider an applicant's race as one of many factors in admitting students to their institutions. And the Supreme Court last June severely limited the ability for colleges and universities to consider applicants' race or ethnicity when making admissions decisions. So that's what most people think of when they think of affirmative action, is in that context. DEI, on the other hand, is most often thought of as workplace policies and programs. And these tend to be race-neutral policies or programs that are things like expanded recruitment efforts, efforts to improve retention of employees, so that if you have a lot of, let's say, people of color leaving the workforce, disproportionate to the rest of the workforce population, there might be some issues going on, right? So DEI practices and policies help organizations beyond employers, beyond the workforce, but they help organizations identify where there might be barriers that are keeping some from having full access and all the tools that others already enjoy.
we have seen over the past several years, not just recently, but over the past several years, a cutting back or pulling back from DEI programs, training, and the like, whether it be with the federal government or private companies. To what do you attribute these changes?
I try not to get too much in the head of the opponents of these bills because I think that they do span sort of the gambit, right? I think some are, frankly, some of the notions behind these bills opposing DEI are straight up. Some of them are based in straight up racism and discriminatory beliefs about the qualifications of people based on their race or identity or other identity. I'll give you an example. We heard over the last year and a half or so this term, they're a DEI hire. Mm-hmm. Well, DEI hire is not a thing. That's illegal. It's been unlawful since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and nothing has changed about that. But by throwing around that word, of course, the implication is that if someone is a woman or has a disability or is a person of color, and they are in a position, in a job, that they're there not because of their qualifications or merit, but because they enjoyed some sort of discriminatory treatment that benefited them. And like I said, that is not lawful. That is not the case. And to assume that someone who doesn't look like you is there not based on their merit, but because they got some preference is deeply discriminatory and biased way of thinking. So some of it comes from that place. I think some other of it comes from a perceived threat that when you provide benefits or you design a program that is supposed to benefit people who have been on the outside, who have not had equal access to the same opportunities for a whole myriad of different reasons, that by doing that you're automatically taking something away from those who don't benefit from the program, who don't need those programs in order to compete equally. And that's not true, right? I'll give you an example. You go to the doctor's office and you see a sign on the wall that is not just in English, but it's in Spanish, and maybe it's in Mandarin and a few other languages. Mm-hmm. Is that taking away from my experience in the doctor's office? If I can read the sign and others can also read the sign, right? And so that is exactly the kind of DEI program that our opponents would take away from us. They think that giving any resources to making a program or an office more equitable, more accessible to others is somehow taking away from their experience and their rights. And that's a very divisive way to see the world. And it's not based on our founding principles as a country.
I'm sure you are aware that some of the companies that I mentioned and others ramped up or began to step into the DEI space after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. There were foundations that were putting money into civil rights activities, education, cultural competence, all of these things. But here we are 4 years later, and there is the pullback. How are beyond them just putting out a press release and saying, okay, we're doing it? Are there other ways that may be considerably more subtle that we aren't necessarily seeing?
It's been so inspiring to learn about all the different kinds of equity programs across our society that exist, some for many, many decades, some more recent. And the more recent investments in communities of color and other historically marginalized communities has really paid off. There are studies and reports to show that these efforts have made a real impact on increasing representation of all kinds of communities in all aspects of society and the economy. And so this has had a positive, very big net gain. Has it all been effective? No. There are some programs that are not as effective as others. There are some that are frankly not effective at all. That's true of any effort, right? And we learn from what works and what fails. But that doesn't mean the whole effort should be taken down. And so, these are important efforts. And you're right that we're starting to see some companies and institutions really rolling back on their own, without, not because they're doing anything illegal, not because they're doing anything that is discriminatory, but just because of this recent public pressure and sort of backlash against DEI and other programs, that they're voluntarily deciding to roll back. Now, I would say that the vast majority of institutions are staying strong and holding fast, and that's heartening. But yeah, there have been some highly publicized rollbacks, which is very detrimental. I mean, those are having devastating impacts on people's lives. And I suspect that some of those decisions are a business decision, right? It's just like maybe some of their decisions to invest in racial equity were also business decisions. Mm-hmm. So, we can't, I guess, lump all these decisions into one or another bucket. I think you see the reasoning and rationale for folks' decisions to invest in equity programming, really to span different reasons.
So I have so many more questions and issues relevant to DEI, where it is, where it's going, where it's not going. And I am wanting to get into that after the break. So please just sit still for just a moment. We are going to take a break, but don't forget, you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. That's our website. The Original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next. That's on WHUR. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation continues on Sirius XM, channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM, channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our conversation about the future of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Will there indeed be a future for it? My guest is Katie Euchre, Director of the Economic Justice Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. As I mentioned before the break, I have so many more questions. One of the things that I'm curious about, because again, this was something that we were hearing even before the most recent backlash, was that there were some programs, both private and government, where there may have been seminars, classes, et cetera, having discussions about diversity, equity, inclusion that, of course, deal with cultural competency, history, and the like. But even anecdotally speaking, there were reports that these were not successful because people were feeling insulted, they were feeling attacked as it relates to taking a deep dive in history, sometimes even learning information about the United States that they heretofore may not have known. And so, do you believe that those kinds of seminars in private industry or in government, whether it be federal or local governments, had an impact on the push against DEI?
Well, there are all kinds of programs, right? And there are some that are better than others. And that's true whether we're talking about DEI or we're talking about nuclear science or we're talking about any other topic, right? And so I think it's unfair to throw out all of DEI doctrine and principles and the value of learning about our history of racism, our history of segregation in this country, where we are today. And, all of these topics are so important for us to learn as Americans so that we can learn from our past and learn how to do better and continue to progress as a country. I think that, if we stop talking about these things altogether, when did that ever benefit anyone to just ignore an issue? I think, from my perspective, for example, as a white person, you don't have to necessarily experience discrimination personally to know that it exists, to see it exists. And of course that a lot of white people have the benefit of not having to think about race every day, all the time. That's a true privilege of being white in this country. And so you're seeing that kind of perspective permeating these proposed bills and these laws, is this idea that, well, it's somehow divisive to bring it up, to talk about reality, the reality of others, of people who don't maybe walk in the world like you, but who are also Americans and deserve to be able to contribute in this country. And, I think that it's pretty I don't want to use the word ignorant, but it is like a form of, willful ignorance to turn all that reality off and decide that we're just not going to talk about it. So yeah, I think that that's where some of the supporters sort of their frame of mind is.
Do you believe that this may be a slippery slope from whether it's, from affirmative action, and we spoke about that earlier, or just DEI, where some organizations, private industry, or maybe even government, with the pulling back from DEI programs, put hiring managers in a position where they may not consider the broad spectrum of candidates for a job?
That's right. And I think that's why it's important to realize just how broad DEI actually is, right? If you think that it just, like, rolling back DEI will just harm Black people and other people of color in this country, you are very sorely wrong. So DEI, for example, includes things like a training for supervisors about accommodations for disabled workers and how to make the workplace more accommodating, more accessible. It's about inclusiveness, right? So that would include a training on sexual harassment, how to report harassment at work. What is it? What does it look like? How do we prevent it? How do we remedy it? Right? It's about services and programs to make sure that everybody is able to participate and bring their full selves to the classroom, to our workforce, to accessing our government and participating in government. So it really permeates all of our institutions and across a broad range of identities in our country. And rolling it back would be devastating for not just communities of color, but really for all of us who benefit when our most talented, most qualified workers are able to have a seat at the table as well.
What impact do you believe this could have on EEO lawsuits?
I mean, I think that the message that you send when you're rolling back DEI programs in the workplace is that you're not going to be heard as a worker, that your complaints of discrimination or bias or aggressions at work are not going to be respected, investigated, listened to. It sort of gives an implicit permission to employers to ignore these kinds of complaints. So there right now is a bill that will likely not pass with this Congress, but in the 119th, we can expect it to resurface, and it has a real likelihood, I think, of passing, which is this Dismantle DEI Act. And it was introduced this last Congress by our incoming Vice President Vance and Representative Cloud from Texas in the House. And, that bill will ban a wide range of DEI programs and their funding in the federal government. And it would have very devastating impacts on our country and really return us to an era where our workforces and our sort of many of our institutions are quite segregated. And unfortunately, some of the proponents of these laws think that that's sort of natural, that they actually use these words that, there's going to be sort of some people from certain communities that are better suited or are, more amenable to certain occupations than others, which is, again, just straight up biased and discriminatory thinking. So that's what we're up against right now. And it's, I think it's incredibly important that people do make their voices heard and make sure that their thoughts about the value of these programs are known.
As director of the Economic Justice Project for the Lawyers Committee, what role is your project, and more specifically, what role are you playing in trying to address this?
So we've seen a lot of attacks on DEI, not just through proposed legislation, but also in the courts. The ruling that all but eliminated affirmative action in colleges and universities has emboldened anti-civil rights activists, anti-racial equity activists to go after even private programs and nonprofits and corporations that are funding and investments in communities of color that have long lacked the same kind of access to capital and opportunities that white Americans have enjoyed. And so one of those cases was against the Fearless Fund Foundation, which was founded by two Black women entrepreneurs to give back to the community and provide seed money to Black women entrepreneurs to help make their businesses grow. And, Edward Bloom, who also brought the cases to eliminate affirmative action in colleges and universities, and a number of other cases, brought this lawsuit on behalf of an organization that he formed with anonymous members who alleged that they were being harmed by this program, that provided very modest seed money. I think they were giving out four of these grants a year. Mm-hmm. So the chilling effect that this has had has been really widespread, and the Lawyers Committee, the Economic Justice Project, and me personally and my team have been filing amicus briefs or friends of the court briefs in these cases across the country to make sure that the court understands the history and purpose of our civil rights laws, that they were really designed to protect and to provide rights and opportunities to Black Americans and other communities of color, and that they should not be weaponized to undo programs that are perfectly consistent with the aims of those acts.
You mentioned the Supreme Court earlier as it relates to affirmative action. Do you think that institutions of higher learning, for example, or the decisions about institutions of higher learning from the Supreme Court will spread to other organizations, again, private industry, nonprofit, government, and the like, if SCOTUS is not affirmative action friendly? Isn't that just the next step up to becoming less DEI friendly?
Well, that's certainly what the opponents of racial equity and civil rights would like to have happen. They're going into court saying, look, the Supreme Court just ruled this way on affirmative action, and we should apply this ruling to all considerations, all acknowledgement of race in this country, even race neutral measures. And I'm talking about, they're trying to dismantle things like even collecting data about race and gender that have no connection to decision making, but are merely there to help inform decision makers about whether and how their programs are impacting certain communities versus others, and whether that there may be some systemic barrier to opportunity there, right? Even things as simple as collecting that, even knowing that data, knowing the race or ethnicity or gender of an applicant is somehow automatically discriminatory in the eyes of these opponents. And so they're arguing that that we should go to a completely colorblind society. And I don't even know how that would work, right? How do you become a colorblind society? But that is the aim, the ultimate aim of these groups that brought the Students for Fair Admissions case, the affirmative action case, and it brought the case against Fearless Fund and others that are ongoing. But besides filing briefs in those cases, we're also providing strategic advice and counseling to stakeholders who are trying to figure out how they can continue to advance equity in these sort of uncertain times. We're also engaging in public education and outreach, so providing resources, legal information to different groups that are feeling impacted to make sure they understand that the law has not changed. Despite the wishes of our opponents, we're not going to voluntarily cede ground where, until someone tells us that it's unlawful. All of these activities continue to be lawful. And so providing that kind of guidance to communities and stakeholders. And we're, engaging in policy advocacy. So lastly, we're doing quite a bit of community building and partnership with other civil rights organizations across a broad spectrum of communities to make sure that all of our voices are being heard as one and unified to preserve these very important civil rights remedies.
What is the danger of knowing that there may be instances of discrimination by organizations or the government or corporations, if there is an attempt through pulling back from DEI to suppress information that women are not being paid an equal amount, or that people of color are not being, and because what I'm hearing, and I keep thinking about Salesforce, for example, a 60 Minutes piece, I believe it was last year, where an employee went to the C-suite and said, and you may be familiar with that, and said that women who were doing the same kind of work, and we're not talking about low-level workers here, but they were being paid considerably less. And you can argue that the CEO did the right thing to prevent a lawsuit, or did the right thing because he wanted to do the right thing. But without that information, the right thing is not possible. So what is the danger of not collecting information and letting the powers that be know that there may be discrepancies?
Right. I mean, the danger is in not knowing, right? The danger is in allowing discrimination to occur and exist in our country. And that costs us, I mean, not just the sort of dignitary harms, but it costs us billions of dollars in our economy when, just that there's a real money cost to discrimination. And when Black and brown business owners or women-owned businesses are not able to compete or get capital and grow their businesses, there's just far too many examples of how this is hurting us as a country, to really whitewash the reality that discrimination is baked into some of our programs and policies and needs to be rooted out, right? We can't, I mean, I think what's so dangerous about this ideology is that, it rests on this presumption that like discrimination is over, that we're past it, that it's a thing of the past. And while we very much would like that to be true, it's not. And we need to be ever vigilant to identifying instances of discrimination and rooting it out, root and stem. So that's a perfect example, the one you just gave about, asking, about someone's, for example, there are policies now, some states that are making it unlawful to inquire during an interview about someone's prior salary. And the reason for that is because it is shown to perpetuate pay inequities, right? So if I'm a woman and I already was paid less than a man for the same work, and my future employer learns, oh, well, this was her prior pay, I can, she's willing to accept something lower than the male candidate, that sort of bakes in that discrimination and allows it to continue. And so programs like that are within the spectrum of DEI that these bill sponsors would like to prohibit.
As a result of the results of the election, there are other organizations, I'm sure, that were very pro-DEI that, like a box turtle, are probably needing or feeling the need to go back into their shells. What effect do you believe that may have on the general populace if they don't necessarily have the support, and by extension, organizations such as the Lawyers Committee? If you are finding yourself having to, as they say, kind of gird yourself up for a bigger fight, but if the other side has now more ammunition to push back, that seems that it will have more of a chilling effect on DEI.
I mean, this kind of moment is exactly what organizations like the Lawyers Committee was built for. Our organization started in 1963. It was, established at the request of President Kennedy to bring the full force of the private bar on the civil rights movement, to the civil rights movement. And we've been working since then very hard to ensure that, our ideals of American democracy are realized along with many other civil rights organizations. And we stand on the shoulders of those that came before us and met much stiffer, frankly, resistance than what we are currently seeing today. Not to minimize it, not to be naive about what we're facing, but it's certainly not a time to back down. If ever It's a time where we need to be more vocal and speak truth to power, right? And not all of us are in the position to be able to do so, but those of us who can, I think we have an obligation to do so. And so we will certainly continue to fight with all of the resources available to us, alongside our sister organizations and communities, to make sure that we do not roll back the decades of progress that are, that are the ancestors and those that came before us fought so hard for. And not just the civil rights movement. We're talking about the workers' rights movement, women's rights movement, the movement for LGBTQ plus individuals, and the Jewish communities and other religious faiths. Right, all of these communities, all of us are impacted by a rollback in these civil rights laws and remedies. So we must be ever vigilant to make sure that our country continues to live up to its ideals.
So let's talk about that, certainly, and I'm sure you can imagine that President Kennedy could not have possibly imagined the kind of world that we live in now, because those who are against DEI, they have lawyers too, number one. Number two, when you speak about what is truth, there is also the argument of there is what some people may see as the truth surrounding DEI and what is accurate. And that seems to me to be one of the biggest and more complex arguments, because what may be true for some may not be true for others. And some things there are, and I can't think of the phrase that was used by one of the former president's communications people, or alternative truth. I think that was the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do you continue to address these issues when what may be true for some is just not true for others when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not everyone is looking at it through the same lens, particularly an economic lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is incredible research and studies that exist already today to show the effectiveness overall of having these policies in place. And so what we call now DEI policies are what in a previous era we would have called integrationist policies. These are just practices and measures to make sure that everyone has a fair shake and the same opportunities. And recognizing that we don't all come into the world with the same access to opportunities. And so it's not, DEI measures are not something that are particularly new. They just have a new name. And but they have been around for many decades. And that it's those very programs that are threatened right now. Many programs across the federal government, and this bill that we're likely to see in some shape or form, either in the next Congress or through other executive actions, would be very far-reaching. So it touches every federal agency and any organization that's getting any kind of federal funding. So that is private organizations that are doing much of the work of the federal government, so federal contractors, but also grantees. And like I said, it goes beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion to include accessibility, which is largely understood to relate to the rights of people with disabilities, it touches on those who come from religious minorities. And it's a very wide-reaching bill that would very much return us to a past where the government would be contributing to social and economic segregation, and that will leave Black communities and many other communities in our country sort of on the sidelines rather than as participants.
My final question for you: in order for DEI to survive, does it have to take a different shape, a different form, even a different name?
I don't think so, because there's nothing unlawful or there's nothing unlawful or harmful about the word DEI or what it's
Not yet.
do, right? Right. So our opponents are certainly trying to make it unlawful, but these are, I'll start where I began, right? I'll finish rather where I began, which is that, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility measures are about opening opportunities to qualified people. It's not about hiring quotas. It's not about preferences. And these are programs that benefit many and don't harm those who don't have to rely on them. And so I don't know why we would sort of voluntarily back off from these very, very important policies and practices that help us ensure that we're meeting our existing civil rights obligations.
Katie Euchre, I appreciate your insight and your thoughtful dissection of this really important issue. It is not going to end here. Arguably, this is only the beginning of the end, and looking for a new beginning. But we will have to continue to look at it. But thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That is the Daily Drum for this Monday, December 9th. I'm Harold Fisher.